Today we're going to talk about portraits. The essential question for the unit is, how do correct measurements of the face, color scheme, and media affect the overall message or mood of an artwork? You can see on the bottom right there are portrait scaffolded notes that you can use to take some notes on all the different concepts that we're going to be talking about today. There are some art vocabulary and techniques that you might want to take some notes on in case there are any quizzes coming up. The learning targets for this unit are: I understand the facial proportions and can apply them in my sketchbook. I can create a variety of facial values in my sketchbook utilizing a variety of media to experiment with color schemes for my final drawing. And I can utilize a unified color scheme to create value in my portrait drawing that has strong enough contrast to see all the facial features easily, especially the facial expression, using chalk pastel, oil pastel, watercolor, gouache, or a combination of 2D art media. We will also be using the Strong-Work Venn diagram, which means your composition or the design of your page should be based on the elements and principles of design, the rule of thirds, experimenting with media and techniques, and having some sort of cultural commentary or communicated idea. You can also see there's a link to the resource artists on the bottom of this page that you should go to. We will be inspired by a resource artist, and we'll also be comparing and contrasting our work with them at the end. We'll also be using the design process of think, make, and improve. Right now we are in the think mode where we're discussing all of the different things that we're going to be doing with the portraits. Very shortly we will be making a bunch of different examples, and then you'll actually be starting your larger portrait drawing. As we're doing that, there will be some in-process critiques as well as the digital portfolio review at the end, and that's where you're going to talk about what you could do to improve and possibly even go into the mode of improving what you've created. So I'm wondering if you guys think that portraits are interesting or challenging. You can put your thumbs down if you think you've done so many that you won't be able to find anything to do. You can put your hand up if you think portraits are amazing and fun and you love them. Or you could put your thumb sideways if you're kind of nervous about this. So I'm also wondering if you can explain why we always talk about the Strong-Work Venn diagram and resource artists when we're creating artwork. If you said it's because I want you to create the strongest work possible in order to help you develop your portfolio and get accolades and awards that you can put in your resume so future employers want you to work for them, that's one reason. And the other reason is knowing how to use many materials and having knowledge of different artists and how they create works with meaning will help you develop those skills that we just talked about. We are also going to be utilizing portrait anatomy as we talk about this. We're going to be learning different parts of the skeletal structure and muscular structure that's underneath the skin so that you understand why value happens on the face the way that it does. A bonus for this is it also makes us sound smart to our science friends because we're going to actually know the terms for the different skeletal and muscular structures that are underneath the portrait. Just like any other assignment, we're going to be doing some thumbnail sketches. You're going to be required to get a couple of different photos of yourself or someone else in order to create this assignment. It's always a good idea to practice the thumbnail sketch in your sketchbook just so that you can experiment with the composition. If you want guidance on where to go with that, you can always ask your instructor. So now we're going to talk about the requirements of the assignment. The first two you can see are the correct facial proportions and facial expression. So the facial proportions mean that there are specific measurements that determine where your facial features go on your face, and then obviously having an expression makes the drawing or painting more interesting to look at. Here you can see this person is angry because of the expression that's on their face. The way that they're baring their teeth and the look in their eyes and their scrunched up nose means that they're angry. Another expression, this one happens to be a look of love. And one thing I want you to notice on the zoomed in picture on the right is you should be able to see there's collage underneath there as well, which enhances or levels up the meaning behind what was created. So the collage that's underneath there is actually the 1 Corinthians love is patient and kind verse, if you've ever heard of that. And that leveled up the meaning behind this portrait that was painted of a couple's wedding day. Some other requirements that you need to be aware of is you need to use unified color value and have strong craftsmanship. So if you look at this image on the right, you can see the color scheme was a warm color scheme. It included yellows, oranges, reds, and even into the browns. What looks like black in there is actually a combination of brown and Cordovan, which is a really dark brown. That is one of the chalk pastels that we have. And then in terms of craftsmanship, craftsmanship is the skill or neatness in which you create something. So here you can see this person took a lot of time and care to make sure that every facial feature was crisp and clean, separated from the other parts of the face and from the background. Another requirement is comparing to a resource artist. So here you can see in the middle, there is a portrait that was painted in watercolor by a Nicolet student in 2017, and she was basing her work in a similar manner to what Kehinde Wiley does with his work. So Kehinde Wiley is a professional artist. He often utilizes floral schemes in the background, and then he does portraits of famous African American people. So as much as the person in the middle was not African American, you can see the homage to Kehinde Wiley in the fact that there are flowers in several portions of that portrait. So those of you that are accelerated or you find drawing really easy, it might be a nice idea to combine two portraits in one drawing, or you could do two separate portraits on two pieces of paper if you finish the first one ahead of time. So now I have a question. Why do facial expressions make drawings more interesting to look at? If you said it's to create drama in the artwork so it's more interesting to look at, you're correct. So here's another more angry facial expression. Hopefully you can tell by the look on the person's face. This person also used red and black, which also helps signify that the person was angry, because red can mean anger. And we're going to talk more about how you can use color schemes to communicate your mood in your piece as well. One other thing that I want to talk about is you could potentially use gesture to capture the facial expression and movement in a person's face or body. It is not a requirement this time, but we are going to be using gesture as we move into the figure unit later on. Here is another example of a facial expression. It is a businessman looking up toward another person during a meeting, and you can see that he has kind of an inquisitive look on his face. And what's interesting about this one as well is the way that the person used the watercolor. They did it kind of in a smudgy type way, so it's not completely smooth the entire time. One of the other things that we're going to be doing in this unit is we're going to be practicing facial value. So you're going to take a worksheet like this one that's on the right-hand side. You're going to trace the facial features into your sketchbook. And then you're going to utilize different color schemes. You're going to experiment with different color schemes and different media in order to figure out what you want to use for your final portrait drawing. Here you can see an example of what those should look like in your sketchbook when they're done. They do not all have to be on the same page, as you can see. There's even a link to the facial value video in there that actually goes through how to utilize the different colors that were in those particular examples. So you can see they're using ebony pencil, they've used chalk pastel and oil pastel, as well as colored pencil. As you do these facial feature examples, you're going to want to get physical photographs, possibly from the internet, or you could take them of yourself or a friend, so that you actually have examples to go off of from life. If you want to actually take the color out and put different color filters over them, it goes over that a little bit in the video. If you need help with that, you can always see your instructor as well. This slide is in here just so that you can see the way that the facial features change depending on how the head is rotated in space. So another thing that we need to talk about is, generally speaking, most portraits are governed by a set of ratios when compared to each other. But what I want you to see is that children and babies have a little bit different facial feature breakups because they're not fully grown yet. So the example on the left shows you the differences that there would be if you were going to draw a child versus an adult. So now we're going to talk about message and mood. Mood is the state of mind or feelings in an artwork that generates something that's tranquil, dark, disturbing, energetic, and it's often created by the color value in the work of art. Your message is what you're trying to communicate as the idea behind what you were doing. If you don't see a meaning in art immediately, you may need to sit and look at it for a while. Here is an example with something that creates a mood. Hopefully you can see it's very dark, ominous, and scary, and it's partly because the person was using a flashlight to highlight their features from below. I'm wondering if you guys can see a message or mood in this piece. Because this is a family portrait, it obviously is at a special event because the ladies are dressed up and they are kind of smiling. They probably could have picked a little bit stronger photo of all three of them smiling at the camera or having a better time. It still communicates that family love though, so still does fulfill the requirements of the portrait. I'm wondering if you can see how both the color and value technique affect the overall image in this Van Gogh. So this is actually a self-portrait that Van Gogh did. Hopefully you can see that he's using cross-hatching or line rendering as he's painting, and he often uses the complementary colors to create the shadows in the facial features. So you can see a little bit of greens and blues underneath the eyes and in his beard to create the depth of the form of his face. Here is another example of mood in a particular drawing. This one happens to be 6 portraits that were broken up pretty much equally on the page. But what you'll notice is they're using a scumbled technique. They even smudged it a little bit in the different parts of the eyes. Hopefully you are seeing the anxiety or nervousness or possibly even anger that's coming through on the way that this particular piece was created. One other thing that I always want you guys to do is experiment with how you're drawing. So this example on the left is a portrait of Teddy Roosevelt, and what you'll see is the person divided their picture plane and only drew portions of it, so it abstracted his face quite a bit. It is fine for you to do that. You can still see the facial features on here, and it's really nice that they're challenging themselves and trying something new. This is another more abstract way of creating the portrait. So if you finish your first portrait and you want to do something totally abstract with the next portrait that you do, if you are accelerated, you could take something like this picture of Albert Einstein. They broke the piece into a bunch of different squares and they highlighted different sections. So you can kind of see there's an eye up here in the middle. This is the left side of his face where you can see his skin and his hair. And there's lots of different zoomed in sections of the photograph that you see in the upper left. I'm wondering why you think I'm making you experiment with new media and techniques. So if you said it was to grow as an artist and have additional skills, you were correct. So here this person is actually including their hand in their portrait drawing, which is something that you can do if you want to. The hands and feet will be our next unit, so we are going to be doing that very soon. It is not a requirement for this assignment. Another thing we need to talk about is line, tone, and stroke. So this is how the utensils can be used in a variety of ways. Line is using one of the corners of a chalk or oil pastel, or possibly the tip of the pencil that you're using. Stroke is technically using the end or the width of the utensil like a pencil eraser. So if I'm looking at this light blue pastel here, it's the length across the bottom that I would be using. That would create a stroke. And then tone technically is using the entire length of the chalk or oil pastel to create a lot of media on the page all at once. Each of these different things used with different speeds and rhythm will create lots of different marks on your piece that will make it more interesting for people to look at. As we had talked about before, it's always a good idea to experiment with media and techniques. That's why we're actually doing those facial features in different values so that you can see what you might like to use for your piece. We are going to do that every time we create a piece because I expect you to use different media each time we create a new piece. So now I'm wondering why you think I'm telling you to practice media before you start creating your final drawing, so that you feel comfortable and confident in your use of the materials. So we should talk a little bit about color scheme. Color scheme is the arrangement or combination of colors used to create a style, mood, or appeal in an artwork. Obviously, there are different media that you can use to create your artwork. The example given here is chalk pastel, oil pastel, and watercolor. There are obviously a couple of other 2D media that you can use as well. So in drawing 2, we're going to be trying to unify color value for the most part. We're actually leveling up what you've learned in drawing 1, and you're going to be learning more about how colors react to each other in order to draw or paint whatever you would like in the future. Utilizing color is going to really level up your game because color is more complicated than anything done in black and white. So this shows you a couple of different color schemes. You can see monochromatic, split complementary, analogous, complementary, double complementary, and a triad relationship. All of those different color schemes would help you create a mood or message. So when we think about color and meaning, I put this wheel on here because it's got a bunch of different meanings that are associated with different colors. Depending on your facial expression and the color that you use, you are going to be able to communicate some sort of idea or even an emotion behind what you are creating. So that is something you're going to need to think about as you select both the photograph that you're going to be using and the facial expression that you pick as well. We're going to have a review of some drawing concepts as well. So remember, we talked about the 4-step drawing process. I'm wondering if you guys remember what steps 1 and 2 are from drawing 1. If you had said seeing and shape finding, you were correct. Now remember, seeing and shape finding are technically done together. So you're looking at the object for an extended period of time and you're trying to find all of the shapes and negative spaces that are within the different object. There aren't necessarily negative spaces in your face, but you definitely need to compare the ratios or the sizes and shapes of the different objects on your face to each other and where they belong on the face. And then as you are blocking in or drawing the outlines, you're going to be doing that very lightly. And steps 1 and 2, seeing and shape finding, are normally done together. The 3rd step would be major value changes, where you're creating all the different layers of value and color on your artwork. And then the very last thing would be details. So on your portrait, that would be things like eyelashes or the lines in your lips or eyebrows or single hairs on your head. As we're talking about shape finding and value, one thing I want you to realize is you could put your photograph into Photoshop and break it into the different values that you see on the portrait. So if you look at this image on the right, you can see it's been put in Photoshop and a filter was placed over the top that shows you the shapes that are created by the different values on the face. There is also a link down here in the lower left that shows you how to adjust your photos in Photoshop. You can use the 2 computers in the back of the room for that. And the instructor will probably have us go to a lab where we can all do that to our photographs all at the same time. And then we will print them out in the classroom at a different date because our classroom has a color printer and the other lab might not. I'm wondering which value technique you haven't used a lot before that you might want to try in this drawing. You're going to have to think about what you did in drawing 1 and what you always have done. A lot of you guys use smudging as your value technique, and that is fine, but really combining different value techniques in order to get different textures and a feeling for your drawing is what we want to try to do. So you need to think about the other value techniques that you might be utilizing. As we move on, those different value techniques are things like stippling. Remember, stippling is using dots to create value. Stippling is also called pointillism. Cross-hatching is using lines that cross to create value. Scumbling is using scribbling lines or the side of the utensil to create value. Smudging is when you actually rub with your finger to create value. And line rendering is using parallel lines to create value. So hopefully you can see on this next example, this person kind of has a nervousness about them, but they were using scumbling and crosshatch in order to create the value on these portraits. One thing you do need to understand is that every portrait actually has different facial proportions and ratios that we're going to be utilizing. We're going to practice this in just a moment with our sketchbooks. There are some portrait steps that we could use to draw the portrait in our sketchbook. We are probably going to do this as we move on in class for today. I'm going through this very quickly right now. We'll go back to the slides in a moment to actually draw that in our sketchbooks. And you can see there's several different steps to draw all the different facial features. So there's a couple different ways that you can draw your portrait. You can either do an intuitive shape finding method or you can use a grid. And we're going to talk about both here quickly. While we're looking at this intuitive shape finding method, basically what you're going to do is you're going to look at something live and then you're going to try to draw the shapes you see and create the value possibly in your sketchbook or on a larger piece of paper. We do have mirrors and easels in the classroom that you can use to do this if that is something that you want to try. I will caution you that drawing from a mirror, drawing from life, is harder than drawing from a photograph. You could do the intuitive shape finding method just with a photograph if you wanted to, or you could use a grid. Basically what you're going to do is make your portrait the same ratio as your larger paper. When you print your photograph, you're going to measure the outside of the photograph, not of the paper itself, and then you're going to use the photograph measurements in order to enlarge the portrait that you're doing. There is a video linked here that you can use that talks about how to use the grid. This one happens to be for an animal drawing, but you could break it down into your portrait as well. When you create a grid, the one thing that you want to make sure that you're doing is always measuring the same direction. So whatever number you used on the ruler, you always want to have that number on the top of the paper on both the left and the right side as you make your little tick marks in order to keep all of the measurements the same. So as you make tick marks, you're going to then take the ruler and draw lines across the page, and then you would do the same thing vertically. We need to talk a little bit about how to keep your photograph proportional to your larger paper. So let's say that your photograph is an 8 by 10. So here on the left-hand side, you can see the person has an 8 and a 10 here, and they multiplied their dimensions by 2 in order to get a 16 by 20. So you can see that the drawing on the bottom is twice the size of the photograph that's on the top. If 16 by 20 seems like a really large piece of paper to use, you can always multiply your dimensions by 1.5 instead. That would make a smaller paper for you. So again, you are going to have to do some math calculations in order to keep your photograph proportional to your larger paper. If that is scary to you, see your instructor, they can help. One other thing that you need to be aware of with the grid is that it is highly suggested that you letter and number the squares that are on your grid like the game Battleship or playing chess. You want to think about having one of the dimensions, so here it's vertical, it's letters, and horizontally it's numbers. It doesn't really matter which way you do it so long as the photograph and the larger paper are the same. Another thing that I normally do is I encourage you guys to use a blocker as you are trying to create the initial blocked in shapes of the outlines of your portrait in each square. So here you can see this blocker is blocking off just Marilyn Monroe's mouth so that the person can just draw what they're seeing in the mouth. Another thing that I would suggest is if you take in Photoshop and you put your photograph into a filter, you can actually get it so that it'll give you outlines instead of just the value like this, and that would have made her lips a little bit easier to see. As you are creating hair, you need to think about the same thing. Just like we looked in the face earlier, there were shapes within it. There are shapes within your hair as well. You may have to create several layers in Photoshop to see the differences between the shapes in the hair or the shapes in the skin or the shapes in clothing that your person might be wearing in order to draw them more accurately. Like I had mentioned earlier, you are going to need to print a picture of your photo. You may need to lighten the photo in order to see all of the different shapes. You're probably going to have to create at least 2 to 3 versions of your portrait in order to be able to see the hair from the skin, from the clothes, from the background. And you might also want to do one that is the outline shape. So you might even end up with like 5 different copies of your photograph in order to help you draw. It's also something that you might need to come in during enrichment or after school in order to get all of those different versions printed for yourself. You do need to remember that as we are creating our portraits, you're going to need to take process photos for your digital portfolio. Remember, we are going to be analyzing the design process outcomes as well, and you should be highlighting any art terminology that you're using along the way. You are also going to be required to compare to a resource artist, so just be thinking about those things as you're creating. You should now be able to answer the essential question from the beginning, and we are going to try to practice the facial proportions as a group in class in a moment.